The fog rolled in thick that evening, draping the streets of Manchester in an eerie, suffocating veil. The wind whispered through the narrow alleyways, carrying with it a cold, damp scent that clung to everything, as though the city itself was exhaling its last breath. Among the dark, weathered buildings stood the forgotten hospital, its once proud structure now a hollowed-out shell, abandoned and left to decay. If the walls of the hospital could talk, they would tell stories of pain, of suffering, of unspeakable horrors, and secrets too dark to ever see the light of day. It had been years since the hospital had been shut down, the doors bolted shut, windows boarded up. But rumors never died, and the whispers had only grown louder. Some said the hospital had closed because of a mysterious outbreak, a disease so deadly, it claimed the lives of everyone within. Others believed the closure was a result of something far more sinister, something that couldn't be explained by medical science. Regardless, one thing was clear: the hospital was a place of death, a place where no one came back from unchanged. The stories began long before it had been abandoned. A local news station had reported strange occurrences within the building's walls, flickering lights, cold spots, and patients who disappeared overnight, their names erased from the records. Staff members quit abruptly, refusing to return to work, citing the strange noises they heard in the night, the feeling of being watched, the inexplicable sense of dread that clung to the very air. Those brave enough to enter the hospital, seeking answers, never returned. The place was cursed, haunted, and no one knew why. James, a young investigative journalist with a passion for uncovering the truth, had heard these stories. He had heard them all, from the curious accounts of old women in the neighborhood to the fearful warnings from local police officers. They all spoke of the same thing: a darkness that had taken root in the forgotten hospital. James, however, was not one to shy away from a challenge. Armed with his camera and a notebook, he set out on what would become the most terrifying journey of his life. It was an overcast day when he arrived at the hospital, the sky a dull gray, and the air heavy with the promise of rain. The large, imposing building loomed in front of him, its stone walls crumbling under the weight of time, its windows cracked and covered in grime. A sense of unease washed over James as he approached the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the rusted door handle, before he pushed it open with a creak that seemed to reverberate throughout the entire building. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overpowering, as though the building itself was rotting from the inside out. James stepped into the dark, empty foyer, his flashlight illuminating the walls, revealing faded signs and peeling paint. His footsteps were the only sound in the vast, empty space. As he moved deeper into the hospital, the temperature dropped. His breath came out in visible puffs of mist, despite the fact that it was not that cold outside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creaks and groans of the building settling. It felt as if the entire hospital was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He made his way down a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with old, rusted medical equipment and broken windows. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, each step making him more aware of the haunting presence that seemed to surround him. He paused in front of a door, its wooden frame warped and splintered. He pushed it open, revealing what appeared to be an old operating room, the air still thick with the remnants of its former use. Medical tools lay scattered across the counter, covered in dust, as though they had been abandoned in the middle of a procedure. The walls were stained with dark, dried patches, and the floor was cracked and uneven. James felt his heart rate increase as he stepped closer to the surgical table, his flashlight flickering as if something was interfering with the power. He glanced around, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. He spun around quickly, but there was no one there. Only the shadows seemed to move, as though they had a life of their own. A sudden cold draft swept through the room, sending a chill down his spine. He shivered, tightening his grip on his flashlight. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint whisper, soft at first, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, a voice full of pain, of fear. James' blood ran cold. He was no longer alone. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a feeling of suffocating terror, a presence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He turned, ready to flee, but before he could make a move, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further. James' breath came out in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispering was no longer a faint murmur, it was a chorus of voices, all crying out in agony, in despair. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, taking on shapes, human shapes. Figures that moved in and out of the darkness, their eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. James backed away, his mind racing for an explanation, but none came. One of the figures stepped forward, its face a blur, as if it were a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. James tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand grazing his arm. A wave of ice-cold energy surged through him, and for a moment, he felt his body go numb, his vision blurred. Then, the figure spoke. The truth, it cannot be forgotten, it rasped, its voice a blend of whisper and scream. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. James stumbled back, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing together, the shadows growing darker. He felt the oppressive weight of the building, as though it was alive, hungry, and he was its prey. The voices around him grew louder, a cacophony of despair, and in the midst of it all, James felt something more sinister. He wasn't just hearing voices, he was hearing the cries of those who had been trapped in this place, their souls forever bound to the hospital. They were not merely ghosts, they were prisoners, victims of something far darker than death itself. The ground beneath him trembled, the lights flickering and dimming, casting long, twisting shadows that danced along the walls. The air was thick with an electric charge, and James felt a presence behind him. He turned, but it was too late. The shadows had already taken form. A figure loomed before him, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It grinned at him, a grotesque, unnatural smile that sent a wave of nausea through him. Its voice was low and guttural, like the sound of nails dragging across a chalkboard. Leave, now, before it's too late. James wanted to run, wanted to escape, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground. The figure reached out, its bony hand grasping his shoulder, pulling him closer. He could feel its cold breath on his neck, could feel the overwhelming weight of its presence bearing down on him. Then, with a force he couldn't explain, James broke free. He sprinted down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, his heart pounding in his chest. The hospital seemed to come alive around him, the walls closing in, the floors shifting beneath his feet. He stumbled, but managed to keep running, the shadows chasing him, their whispers growing louder with each step. The exit was in sight. He was almost there. But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut before him, trapping him inside once more. The shadows closed in, their cold fingers brushing against his skin, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. And then everything went silent. The hospital was empty once again. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, and James was gone, his name lost to the void. The forgotten hospital in Manchester stood still, waiting, as it always had. The darkness remained, its secrets buried deep within the walls, waiting for the next soul to enter, to uncover what had been forgotten. But some things are better left untouched. And so, the cycle continues.